I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Baldwin. Alec?
I'm going to try to make this brief. I'm Alec Baldwin. And by the way, before we continue, is there anybody here who's with Honeywell? Anybody here from Honeywell? Did anybody from Honeywell come? No? Okay. My family moved to this area in 1987. My mother is from downtown Syracuse, and her siblings and her parents lived on Roosevelt Avenue in the heart of Syracuse. My mother moved to Long Island and raised her family and lived there for over 30 years. And then when my father passed away in 1983, my mother relocated here to where she's from in 1987 with my sister and her husband and their children. And then my other sister moved up here, and what had been a base of operations for my family on Long Island and residential Long Island had shifted over the years to actually up here to Syracuse. So Syracuse is which has always been, I've always had a relationship with through my extended family, is now kind of my second home, because I don't have any relatives on Long Island anymore. And ever since my family has come up here in 1987, everybody knows that Onondaga Lake is the only certified dead lake in the state of New York. You know, it was just, that's what they used to say to us all the time. Just chemical corporations pouring stuff in there decade after decade after decade. Now, there's a lot of perspectives I could offer you, but I'll limit them, and I want to say, do you think that people like yourselves, mothers, fathers, people who care for their children, community-minded, taxpayers, homeowners, citizens of a community as you are now, do you think that they sat here in the 60s and 70s and gave their tacit approval that Allied Chemical would dump all this stuff into Onondaga Lake year after year after year? I doubt it. I doubt it. The way this stuff always happens is that corporations get behind closed doors with elected officials and with agencies like the state DEC, and they say, if you make us do what we really ought to do, what you think we ought to do, we're never going to admit that what we've done is wrong. Yeah, we poured all the chemicals into the lake, but we're never going to admit that was a bad thing. But you say it's a bad thing, and you say we shouldn't have done that, and you say there might be potential health hazards for your community. But we're going to tell you that if you really break our chops about that too much, we're out of here. As we all know, this is what happened with GE and with the PCBs in the Hudson River. The GE case is really emblematic of everything we're talking about here. A major corporation that just threatened communities and threatened communities and threatened the state DEC continuously, decade after decade. If you hold our feet to the fire, and their hope, of course, in the GE PCB case, and again, these are my opinions, because you can get a scientist to say anything you want to these days. My opinion is that, you know, they waited long enough. They wanted sediments to bury the PCBs long enough, decade after decade, where it became a real chore to remediate that area of the Hudson. They were saying better to leave it undisturbed. It's buried now under several feet of sediment, because that's a big river. And they say, you know, if you were to churn it up, it would create more problems. It's better off left where it is. Now up here they'd say the same thing. If we dig this stuff up, it may create plumes. I remember hearing that kind of discussion all the time up here. That remediation of the Allied chemical contamination, and there are other corporations, by the way, that are responsible for this up here. It's not just Allied and now Honeywell. They said if you were to remediate this stuff in the way it ought to be done and take this stuff out of there, you might have gaseous plumes and vapors that could spread and drift, and you'd have problems in terms of inhalation and so forth. I mean, ever since my family has been up here since 1987, now it's 23 years, this is a situation where it was a problem, and Honeywell litigated the hell out of it so they could avoid as much responsibility as they could. Now they come into the next phase, which is they admit that something needs to be done, and they admit that they're partially responsible. But the state and the feds are partially responsible too, they maintain, because they were given permission. They didn't do this illegally. This wasn't illegal dumping. They were given permits by the state to do this. So the state is complicit and the federal EPA is complicit, so you have this triumvirate of people who will have to share the cost of remediating this problem. So the next phase is Honeywell will say to you, well, here's how much we can afford. Here's how much we're in for. It's $451 million. That's all we've got. And someone from Honeywell is sitting in a room where they have big zoning maps of Onondaga County, and they say, you know, we got these waste beds here that we've been putting these chlorine byproducts in from the old soda ash processes that were done here for many decades. And we own that property. Honeywell owns that property. Honeywell owns Waste Bed 13. And they're like, we're not going to send this stuff down to Texas, down to some dedicated, willing repository of intense chemical waste. Because let's face it, the stuff at the bottom of Onondaga Lake is as bad as it gets in terms of being non-nuclear. It's the worst you're going to find. It's bad. This is not the byproduct of some solvate process, soda ash thing. These are not a bunch of salts and chlorines and things like that. This is some of the worst chemical contamination you're going to find. And they're going to sit there and say, well, we own these waste beds, and we're going to just go ahead and drop that stuff off there. For $451 million, that's what you're going to get. We're in for $451 million, but we're not going to ship this stuff. That's going to break our back. We're going to drop it right here. Well, that area has changed. Where those waste beds exist, that area has changed. There are homes there, and people are raising their families there, and there are schools there, and there are children there. Who knows what the toxicological state of those sites are now? What if you did well testing? What if you did toxicological testing of Waste Bed 13 and you found out that I'm not a scientist, I don't know, I'm not an engineer. But what if that site is no longer contaminated? I don't know how many millions, billions of gallons of residue from the soda ash process were dumped there many years ago. But what if that site had been basically remediated now? What if you could conceivably build homes on that site, build schools on that site, build parks on that site? You could reclaim that land. The goal that the people of this community should have in mind is not to make things more toxic than they are, it's to make things less toxic than they are. Honeywell's attitude, but I want to just finish this because we're going to take some questions too. Honeywell's attitude is, well, it's already dirty. How do we know that? You're going to take Honeywell's word for it about what the state of those waste beds are? Honeywell's attitude is that it's already contaminated. You need to have testing done there. Everything in terms of dumping anything on those waste bed sites needs to stop. But at the same time, the pumping doesn't need to stop. Honeywell will turn around and say to you, hey man, we're not going to ship this stuff to Texas. We're not going to pay the way other people say to send really hazardous chemicals, chemical residue to Texas and spend all that money. I think you should be suing them. And I think that the state should be ordering them to continue pumping because they're already admitting that they're on the hook for this. And they've already agreed that they would pony up $450 million. Order them to continue to pump and force them to ship until you have answers about what the status, the toxicological status of those waste beds are.